We have been looking for the last few weeks at the subject of forgiveness. Today, we want to begin a two-part study on looking at Psalms chapter 32. This is a psalm that deals with the attitudes in having true forgiveness and having true repentance. David wrote this psalm, and it's written out of the guilt that he had because of the adultery that he had committed with Bathsheba and the ultimate murder of her husband Uriah. And David writes this psalm in way of helping himself forgive himself and over his remorse of his conduct and his actions. It stresses that life away from God's forgiveness is miserable. What David is going to do in this psalm is he's going to demonstrate how miserable man will truly be if he does not seek and find true forgiveness from God. And David is going to demonstrate this in this psalm of his deep remorse and his deep pain because of his conduct and him alienating himself from God because of his actions. Encourage others to confess to God. What this particular psalm does, it encouraged the sinner to seek God's forgiveness. And that's what all sinners need to do. And since we all have sinned, according to Romans 3:23, and since the wages of that conduct is death, Romans 6:23, then the sinner needs to seek God's forgiveness. He needs to petition the throne of grace and mercy in order to gain forgiveness. And until he does that, he is going to be miserable in his sin, and he's going to be alienated from God. And so this psalm is to reiterate and to reinforce the need of the sinner to seek God's forgiveness because of their conduct and their sins against God. Now, in the blessedness of one, the forgiven one. In Psalms 32, we're looking at the first two verses. Blessed is he whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. Blessed is the man to whom the Lord does not impute iniquity, and whose spirit there is no deceit. Now notice, blessed is the one whose transgression is forgiven him. Now, we need to understand it denotes a song enforcing some lesson of wisdom and piety. This contemplation, it denotes a song that enforces some lesson of using wisdom and or piety. Now, what does he mean by that? Well, let's look a little deeper. Notice, blessed is the one whose transgression is forgiven and whose sin is covered. Now, sin is missing the mark. It is aiming to miss the mark. It is transgression of the law. It's rebellion against the Lord. And it is wandering from the way. It's either done in omission, that means we do it intentionally, or we do it by commission, by failure to do what we ought to do. In 1 John 3 verse 4, the Bible very clearly gives us the definition of what sin is. In 1 John 3 and verse 4, whoever commits sin commits lawlessness, and sin is lawlessness. 1 John 5 verse 17 says, all unrighteousness is sin, and there is a sin leading to death. And so, blessed is the man whose sin and transgression is forgiven. That's missing the mark. You missed the mark that God has given us in the proper conduct and action, and aiming to miss the mark. We know what the mark is. We know what the conduct should be. We know what we ought to do, but we don't do it. Then we miss it, and that's sin. It's a transgression of the law. God has established there are things that we can do and things that we ought not to do. And when we go beyond what the law instructs us to do, then that is sin. And if we rebel against the Lord, as Saul did in 1 Samuel 15 in failure to carry out God's instruction, rebelling against the Lord, that's sinful. And when we wander from the way, when we wander from the pattern and the path that God has given us, then we do that either by omission, by doing that which we know we ought not to do, or we do it by commission, by forgetting and failing to do what we know we ought to do. Both those things result in the same problem. They result in sin being committed. Blessed is the one whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. Notice, the transgression results in sin, and that sin is covered. But how is it covered? We're going to cover that in this lesson. We need to have that sin covered. And verse 2 says, blessed is the man whom the Lord does not impute iniquity. Iniquity is lawlessness, is to act without authority, and whose spirit there is no deceit. I mean, deceit, that is something that's misleading. That's something that's not what it appears to be. Transgression is passing over a boundary. Sin is missing the mark. Iniquity is perverted or distorted. Deceit is something that's fraudulent or is guile. And so we need to understand that when we pass over a boundary, we pass over what God has told us to do, we commit sin. And sin is when we miss that mark that God has established for what is proper behavior, and we pervert or distort the law, and we act without God's approval or authority, then we've sinned. And if we do it fraudulently, or we do it with guile, and we're deceitful about it, that results in the same thing. So these things cause us to need God's forgiveness. Such conduct is needful for us to seek the forgiveness of God. When I kept silent, my bones grew old through my groaning all the day long. For day and night your hand was heavy upon me. My vitality was turned into drought of summer, Shelah, when I kept silent. You see, the blessing is the one that confesses the wrong, the one that acknowledges his sinful action and acknowledges his part and his responsibility in his action. But when a person keeps silent, they refuse to confess, they refuse to acknowledge their part and their responsibility in their action, that's going to cause internal problems. That's going to cause internal struggles within us because we know we're wrong, we know that we did wrong, but we're stubbornly unwilling to acknowledge and accept our accountability and our responsibility, and therefore we have this internal struggle, knowing that we're wrong, but not doing the things that are needed in order to correct it. Then we're going to, his hand is heavy upon us because our guilt is going to condemn us. I acknowledge my sin to you, and my iniquity I have not hidden. I said, I will confess my transgression to the Lord, and you forgive the iniquity of my sin. I acknowledge my sin. I acknowledge. David is saying, I acknowledge it. I did it. I'm wrong. You remember when Nathan came to David and said, David, you're the man. You did this. You took another man's wife, and you sinned, and you caused God's enemies to blaspheme. He says, I acknowledge it. I accept my accountability. I accept my responsibility. And he acknowledged it to God. And my iniquity I have not hidden. He tried to hide it in the beginning. He tried to hide it. He had tried to cover it up, and it didn't work. And it eventually led him to commit murder and have Uriah killed in battle in order to cover up his sin. But it didn't work, and it never will work. You can't hide your iniquity. It can't be hidden, and as long as you try to hide it, it's going to haunt you and it's going to hurt you. And I will confess my transgression to the Lord, because he's the only one that can forgive me. I'm going to have to confess my accountability, my responsibility. My actions were wrong, and I did it, and I'm guilty, and I beseech God to forgive that iniquity of my sin. And that's the only way that the eternal struggle and the eternal strife that goes on within us, because we know that we're not right with God, and we know we're not right because we've committed sin, that struggle will never go away, and that internal feeling of being lost and knowing that we're accountable and we're rebelling and we're being stubborn, that's not going to go away until we acknowledge that it's my sin. It's not somebody else's fault. It's not some situation's fault. It's my fault because of my actions or lack of action, and therefore I'm going to have to come to grips with that I'm going to have to accept the consequences of my behavior. Misery moves for mercy. Have mercy on me, O Lord, for I am in trouble. My eyes waste away with grief, yes, my soul and my body, for my life is spent with grief, and my years with sighing. My strength failed because of my iniquity, and my bones wax away. You see, misery moves for mercy. You understand the consequences. You understand what sin is doing to you. It's holding you in bondage. It's holding you, alienating you from God. And if you don't take care of it, it's just going to get more and more difficult for you to repent of it, and it's just going to take you deeper down the path. It's going to hold you longer, and what it's going to do is going to be more and more difficult for you to get over it because your stubborn will is allowing you to make excuses. You see, misery moves for mercy. I'm in trouble. When you and I are guilty of sin, we are in trouble. We are in dire need of God's forgiveness. I don't care what the sin is. I don't care how small or large it is. When you and I sin, when the sinner sins against God, he is in a dilemma. And he's going to remain in that dilemma, and it's going to get worse and worse and worse, and it's going to get tougher and tougher to do as long as he fails to understand that he's in trouble because of his own action. And my eyes waste away with grief, my soul and my body. For my life is spent in grief and sighing. Why? Because you know you're guilty. You know that you're wrong. You know that you did this for whatever reason you want to try to justify it or rationalize it. It doesn't matter. You know you were wrong. You know you acted incorrectly. You know that you're accountable. You know you're responsible. And you've got to have this internal strife until you deal with it. And so misery is going to seek out mercy. This internal strife that's caused by knowing that my sin is still against me, that my sin is hanging over my head. This eternal strife is going to get worse and be more pronounced the longer I try to fight against my responsibility and my need to seek God's forgiveness. I am reproached among all my enemies, but especially among my neighbors, and I am repulsive to my acquaintances. Those who see me outside flee from me. I am forgotten like a dead man. Out of mind, I am like a broken vessel. You see, there are repercussions. Other people are going to shy away. Other people don't want anything to do with you because you've acted in an incorrect way, and you've sinned against maybe someone else, or you've sinned against a number of people, or you've hurt a number of people, and so you're isolating yourself by your conduct. And you're going to remain in that condition until you acknowledge that you did it, that you're responsible, that you're accountable. And whether you ever do that or not, ladies and gentlemen, God's going to hold you to that accountability because it's your choice, it's your action, it's your decision. And when you do it, you need to seek God's remedy. And his remedy is true forgiveness. And that forgiveness will never be forthcoming until we acknowledge our part in our sin and our need for God's forgiveness. You see, misery moves for mercy. I'm a broken man. I'm broken down. I'm alienated from God. I put myself in this position. And the only way of getting it corrected is I'm going to have to seek God's mercy. His love and his mercy and his grace. And his willingness to forgive me. But you'll never obtain it, and you'll never gain it until you acknowledge that you need it, and your part in it in what you did or what you didn't do. For I hear the slander of many. Fear is on every side. While they take counsel against me, they scheme to take away my life. You see, there are repercussions, there are consequences. When we sin against other people, there are others involved. That sin does not remain unknown. That sin does not go quietly away. And you can bury your head in the sand like an ostrich, and you can act by ignoring it and just putting it behind you and not thinking about it. that somehow it's going to go away, but it's not. What it's doing is slowly eating away at your soul. It's eating away at your peace. It's eating away at inner peace. Because you know that there are things in your life that are wrong. You know there are things that need to be corrected. You know that there are things that are alienating you from God. They're even alienating you from family, from friends, and from acquaintances. And you're in this predicament because you're being stubborn and you're unwilling to yield to the acknowledgement of your part in this problem and your unwillingness to seek God's forgiveness and His mercy. But again, that's something you have to do. Nobody can do it for you. O Lord, do not rebuke me in your wrath, nor chasten me in your hot displeasure. For your arrows pierce me deeply, and your hand presses me down. There is no soundness in my flesh, because your anger, nor any help in my bones because of my sin. You see, God has every right to treat us in a wrathful way. We are logically and rightfully recipients of God's wrath. Why? Because we've sinned against Him. We've transgressed His law. We've rebelled against Him. And because of that, I have this internal strife. And I know that His wrath, I don't want Him to give me, I want God's mercy. I don't want what I deserve. What I deserve is God's wrath. What I deserve to be chastened. I don't want that. I want God's mercy. I want His love. I want His grace. And you see, for your arrow pierced me deeply. What does He mean by that? He just means that's the knowledge. That's the knowledge we have that we're not right with God. That's that internal strife. That's that internal conflict that we have, that we know our life's not right with God. That we know there are things in our lives that we need to correct. There's behavior that we need to rescind, and there's things that we need to do in order to make our life right. And again, those things must come from the person. Nobody can make you do that. God can't make you do that. And the devil can't make you stay in rebellion and in stubbornness. That's something you choose to do. But as long as you choose to do that, you're going to remain in bondage to that sin. And you're going to have this guilt. You're going to have this burden of guilt. You're going to have this internal conflict. You're going to have this strife within yourself, knowing that your conduct is wrong, knowing that your behavior is wrong, yet it's simple to get over it and recover from it, but it takes accountability and responsibility of the person seeking God's mercy. You've got to realize that you've alienated yourself from God. You've made yourself an enemy of God by your actions, and you need to seek restitution. But you can't do that until you accept accountability. For my iniquities have gone over my head. Like a heavy burden, they are too heavy for me. My wounds are foul and festering because of my foolishness. You see, I get overwhelmed. It's just like there's no end. There's no light at the end of the tunnel. It just seems hopeless. It just seems like I'm in a rut and I can't get out of it. And I'm going round and round and I'm not getting any better. You see, the problem is that my iniquities have encompassed me. They've taken hold of me. They've held me in bondage. My actions and my unwillingness to seek God's mercy, to seek God's grace, to seek God's love and His long-suffering and His forgiveness is causing me this internal struggle. And notice the language here. It's like a heavy burden. It's like a load of bricks you're carrying every day. It's like something you're dragging around. And you're dragging around and you don't need to drag it around. You're dragging it around and it's weighing you down. And it's on your mind constantly. And you know that it's wrong. And you know you should correct it. And you know you need to get it forgiven. But you carry it around. You continue to allow it to hold you in bondage. But why? Because you are unwilling or stubborn, or you just will not accept your personal accountability. Therefore, your sin is going to consume you. It is just going to eat away at you slowly. And this is going to happen because you know that you need to make things right. Now what Satan's going to try to do is want you to put it out of your mind. Is just not look at it, not examine it. Don't worry about it. that God will forgive it just in time. You don't need it. It's not really that bad. And all these lies and this deceit is to allow you to remain in bondage to sin. But that bondage to sin is only as tight and controlled as you allow it to be. You can break that. You can release that burden. And the foolishness that you did, you can correct it. But you never will until you acknowledge you did it. Nobody made you do it. Nobody caused you to do it. You made a bad choice. You made a bad decision. You went down the wrong path. And so you need to correct it. But you can't correct it until you acknowledge your accountability and your part in it. See, God can't do that for you. That's something you have to do for yourself. I am troubled. I am bowed down greatly. I go mourning all the day long, for my loins are full of inflammation, and there is no soundness in my flesh. I am feeble and severely broken. I groan because of the turmoil in my heart. You see, the condition attributed to sin. You have this internal strife. You have this internal struggle. Why? Because you're unforgiven. Because you're carrying this burden and guilt of your sin. And you're dragging it around like a weight around everywhere you're going. Look at this language, ladies and gentlemen. I'm troubled. I'm bowed down greatly. It burns you down. I go mourning all the day long. My loins are filled with inflammation. There's no soundness in my flesh. I'm feeble. I'm severely broken. I groan. Do you see? You have all this conflict in your life. You have all this adversity. You have all this inner struggle in your mind because you know you're wrong. You know you did wrong. You know you acted inappropriately. You know that you're the responsible person. And instead of facing it, instead of acknowledging it, instead of turning from it, repenting of it, and seeking God's forgiveness, you continue to drag it around. And you continue to let it burn you down. And you continue to let it cause you inner turmoil. And there's no peace. There's no rest. Because all of this is weighing heavy on your heart. You're doing it to yourself. You see, that's the nature of sin. That's the nature of the beast. You see, when it controls you, for a time, it's going to do all these things to you. But if you continue to allow it to do so, what it's going to do is going to sear your conscience. It's going to sear your feeling to where it doesn't feel. It doesn't feel the pain of sin. It doesn't feel the need for repentance. It doesn't feel the need to get right with God. And the longer you remain in bondage of sin, that's the path you're going down. And you're going down a path that you're going to have to fight against your inner feelings in order to stay in bondage to sin. You're doing it to yourself. But Satan will help you do it. And you'll remain in that condition. And take a good look at this terminology. The turmoil in your heart. You know you're wrong. You know you can correct this. You know you can get past this. But you have too much pride. You're not going to acknowledge your part in it. You want to blame everything else except acknowledging that you did it. Then you're going to remain in this dilemma. And so David is saying that's a poor decision to make. That's a poor road to travel. And so we need to come up with a different plan that will release this guilt and burden and internal strife that our sin causes in our life. Lord, all my desire is before you, that my sighing is not hidden from you. My heart pants, my strength fails me. As for the light of my eyes, it also has gone from me. My loved ones and my friends stand aloof from my plague, and my relatives stand afar off. You see, there are consequences. There's things that are taking place in the individual's life because he's fighting against doing what's right. He's fighting against doing what he knows he needs to do. He knows what's right. He knows what he needs to do. He knows what course he needs to be pursuing. But his pride and his stubborn will won't let him relent. And so then he's going to have all of these difficulties and these consequences because he remains shackled to his sin. Poor decision. But we do it to ourselves. And sin will do that if you don't deal with it. Sin will do this over a course of time unless you deal with it. Unless you come to grips with your accountability and your actions and what sin is doing to you. The longer you remain in it, then you're going to put yourself in a predicament where it can sear your conscience and your feelings. When I kept silent, my bones grew old throughout my groaning, all the day long. For day and night your hand was heavy upon me, vitality was turned into the drought of summer. You see, ladies and gentlemen, the longer you remain in the bondage to sin, it weakens you. It weakens your resolve. It gives you inner turmoil. It weakens your ability to cope with life. You see, because you have this guilt that you're carrying around. You have this adversity that you're not addressing. You have this conduct that's hanging over your head because you're not seeking God's mercy, His compassion, His love, and His forgiveness. You see, in closing this morning, by your silence, you are making His hand heavy upon you. Your silence is your failure to acknowledge the need for forgiveness. You see, as long as you do that, then your sin hurts you. Sin is something that has a destructive power, but it only has that destructive power for as long as you allow it to hold you. And the longer that you rebel against it, and the longer you fail to acknowledge it, then it's going to consume you internally. Now, don't believe me. Go ahead and remain in it. Go ahead and try to ignore it. Go ahead and put your head in the sand. You can do all those things. But in the end, it's going to destroy you if you don't acknowledge that you need God's forgiveness. I want to thank you for listening today. We ask you to tune in again next Lord's Day as we'll conclude our study of Psalms chapter 32. If you want to, go and read over this psalm a few times and get familiar with it and be able to understand the emphasis that David is putting on the acknowledgement of one's conduct and what results in your failure to do that.